40 years. That's how long a man can break his back under a relentless sun, turning stubborn earth into a sprawling legacy of cattle and pasture. 40 years of calloused hands, of mended fences and long nights spent birthing calves in the biting cold. For Arthur, those 4 decades were the sum of his life, poured into the soil of the Blackwood Ranch like a libation to a demanding god. And now, standing on the dusty steps of the county courthouse, it all amounted to nothing more than a single, contemptuous piece of paper clutched in his trembling hand. The ink, stark and black, declared him a stranger to his own life. Divorced. Dispossessed. He watched as Beatrice, the woman who had shared his bed and board for all those years, walked away without a backward glance. Her chin was held high, her posture as rigid and unyielding as it had been in the courtroom. Beside her, her son, Reginald, a man Arthur had raised from a scrawny boy, offered his mother his arm. Reginald shot a final, triumphant smirk over his shoulder, a look that said, "You are finished, old man." They didn't just take the ranch, they took the years, hollowing them out until they were just an empty echo. He was left with the horse he'd ridden into town on, the worn clothes on his back, and a small, heavy pouch of coins they'd pressed into his hand as a final act of charity. A pittance meant to feel like an insult, and it did. It felt like being paid a few cents for each of the 14,600 days of his labor. Can you imagine the coldness required for such an act? To erase a man not with a bullet, but with a signature and a condescending jingle of coins? Arthur stood there until their figures became a shimmering dot in the afternoon heat, the courthouse doors closing behind them with a solemn thud that seemed to punctuate the end of his world. The town bustled around him, but he felt utterly, terrifyingly still, a statue of a forgotten man. He was 62 years old, with the aches of a lifetime settled deep in his bones and a future that was a terrifying, blank canvas. The world he had built, the only world he knew, had been dismantled board by board, and he was left standing in the ruins. The journey back to the place that was no longer his home was the longest ride of his life. Every rock and every crooked tree was a memory, a ghost of a past that now belonged to someone else. He remembered clearing this very path with his father, Samuel, when he was just a boy. He remembered bringing Beatrice here as a young bride, her eyes wide with a feigned wonder that he now understood was just an assessment of its value. She had come into the marriage with nothing but a trunk of fine dresses and a young, sharp-eyed son. Arthur, his heart full and foolish, had welcomed them both. He'd given Reginald his name, his time, his guidance, but the boy's loyalty had always been a closed circle, encompassing only himself and his mother. For 40 years, Arthur had been the muscle and the sweat of the Blackwood Ranch. He worked the land while Beatrice worked the ledgers. "You handle the dirt, Arthur," she'd say, her voice smooth and dismissive. "I'll handle the figures." It's for the best. He trusted her. Why wouldn't he? She was his wife. He saw the new dresses, the trips she and Reginald took to the city, the way their lifestyle slowly elevated while his own boots grew more worn. He just assumed it was the fruit of their shared labor, a sign of their success. He never realized he was funding the construction of his own prison, where she was the warden and he was the lifelong inmate, sentenced to hard labor. The slow, creeping poison of it all became clear only at the end, when her lawyer produced meticulously kept records detailing his lack of financial contribution, painting him as little more than a hired hand on his own land. They had twisted his sweat into a liability, his sacrifice into incompetence. They argued he had been provided for food, shelter, and that the ranch's growth was due to her shrewd management. The judge, a man who smelled of city cigars and impatience, had agreed. It was a masterful, cold-blooded performance, decades in the making. He was an obstacle they had finally, neatly, removed. He was given until sundown to collect his personal effects. The term felt like a joke. What was personal to him was the very soul of the place, the worn spot on the porch where he sat every evening, the scent of hay in the barn, the lowing of the cattle at dawn. Those were his effects, and they were not things he could pack into a steel bag. Inside the house, Reginald was already directing 2 men, pointing at furniture, deciding what to sell and what to keep. He didn't even acknowledge Arthur's presence. It was the ultimate act of erasure. Arthur walked past him, his face a granite mask, and went to the small room he'd always used as his own. It was sparse, holding little more than his cot and a small wooden chest containing the few things that were truly his. He knelt and opened it. Inside were his father's things, a worn leather journal, a tarnished silver belt buckle, an old compass. He packed them carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. As he lifted the journal, something slipped from between its pages and fell to the floor with a soft clink. It was a heavy, ornate iron key, attached to a small, folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. He'd never seen it before. He picked it up, his thumb rubbing over the key's intricate, unfamiliar design. He unfolded the parchment. It wasn't parchment at all, but a crude, hand-drawn map, sketched in his father's unmistakable hand. It showed the vast expanse of the Blackwood Ranch, but his father's ink focused on a small, remote corner of the property, a dense patch of forest at the northernmost edge that Arthur had always considered useless timberland. A single spot was marked with a small X. Beneath the map, his father's script was shaky but clear. "For when the world turns its back on you, son," it read. Your true inheritance. A cold shock ran through him. His father had been a quiet, watchful man, one who spoke little but saw much. Had he seen this coming? Had he known, all those years ago, the nature of the woman his son had brought home? The thought was a flicker of light in the crushing darkness of his despair. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was just a question. And right now, a question was more than he'd had all day. With his little bag packed and his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, Arthur left the house he had built and did not look back. He rode away from the life that had been stolen from him, the weight of the key in his pocket a small, solid presence against his thigh. He had nowhere to go, no plan, just the vague direction offered by a dead man's map. He rode north, towards the forgotten corner of the land that was, for a few more hours at least, still technically his to travel upon. The landscape shifted as he rode, the familiar open pastures giving way to rolling hills and then to the dense, tangled woods depicted on the map. The air grew cooler, smelling of pine and damp earth. This part of the ranch had always been ignored. It was too difficult to clear, the terrain too rugged for grazing. It was a wild, untamed place, a stark contrast to the orderly, fenced-in world he had just left behind. For the first time in 40 years, he was truly alone. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures and the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. For another man, this might have been terrifying. But for Arthur, the solitude was a strange comfort. Out here, there were no judging eyes, no whispers of failure. The trees didn't care that he was a ruined man. The earth didn't mock his poverty. He was just a man, small and insignificant beneath a vast, indifferent sky. He was nothing, and in that nothingness, there was a peculiar kind of freedom. He followed the map, matching the crude drawings of creeks and rock formations to the world around him. His father had been precise. Every landmark was exactly where the map said it would be. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees, he felt a weariness so profound it was almost a physical illness. What was he even doing? Chasing a ghost, following the scribbles of a long-dead man into the middle of nowhere. It was a fool's errand, the last desperate act of a broken spirit. He was about to give up, to make a small camp for the night and face the bleak dawn of his new reality when he saw it. It wasn't much, just a slight parting in the dense wall of ancient pines, a path so overgrown it was almost invisible. The map showed that X just beyond a distinctive cluster of 3 large boulders. He dismounted, his joints protesting, and pushed his way through the thick undergrowth. And there, nestled in a small, hidden clearing, was a cabin. It was small and unassuming, built of dark, weathered logs that blended so perfectly with the surrounding forest that you could stand 20 feet away and never know it was there. Moss grew in the crevices of the roof, and thick vines clung to its sides, anchoring it to the earth. It looked as if it had grown out of the ground itself, a natural part of the woods. It was a secret, kept safe by the wilderness. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was real. He walked slowly towards it, his boots sinking into the soft, pine-needle-covered ground. The air in the clearing was still and silent, holding the kind of deep peace that only comes from decades of solitude. There was a single door and one small opening for a window, covered by a heavy wooden shutter. He reached the door and pulled the iron key from his pocket. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely guide it towards the lock. With a deep breath, he slid the key into the keyhole. It fit perfectly. He turned it. The sound of the old lock turning was deafening in the silence, a loud, metallic groan that echoed through the clearing. It was the sound of a long-held secret finally giving way. He pushed the heavy door inward. It swung open on creaking hinges, revealing a dark, musty interior. He stepped across the threshold, moving from the last light of dusk into a space that held the accumulated darkness of years. It was a step into the unknown, a step into his father's mystery. For the first time since leaving the courthouse, a feeling other than despair began to stir within him. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there. It was curiosity. The air inside was thick with the scent of dry wood, dust, and time itself. He fumbled for a moment, then found the wooden shutter and pushed it open, letting the fading evening light spill into the small, single room. It was starkly simple. A stone hearth stood against one wall, a small stack of firewood still resting beside it, as if waiting for a match. A rough-hewn table and a single chair sat in the center of the room. A narrow cot was built into the far wall, a thin, flattened mattress upon it. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of dust, undisturbed for what must have been decades. It was a time capsule, a moment of his father's life perfectly preserved. Arthur ran a hand over the dusty table, his fingers leaving clean streaks in the grime. This was his father's place. A secret sanctuary. But why? Why go to such lengths to hide it? His gaze fell upon a sturdy, iron-banded chest tucked away in the darkest corner of the room, almost hidden beneath the cot. It was locked, not with a keyhole, but with a heavy, rusted latch. It took all his strength to pry it open, the metal shrieking in protest. Inside, nestled on top of a folded wool blanket, was a small, leather-bound satchel. He lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. Untying the leather strap, he reached inside and pulled out a stack of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was his father's. His breath caught in his throat. He sat on the edge of the dusty cot, the last rays of sunlight falling across the pages as he untied the ribbon and began to read the first letter. The date at the top was from over 40 years ago, just weeks after his marriage to Beatrice. "My dearest Arthur," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am long gone, and the world has shown you a face I always feared it would. I hope you never have to read these words, but a wise man prepares for the storm even on a sunny day," his father went on to explain. He'd never trusted Beatrice. He saw an avarice in her eyes, a cold ambition that his love-blinded son could not. So, he had taken a precaution. The land the cabin stood on, a small parcel of 50 acres, was not part of the Blackwood Ranch. Samuel had purchased it himself, years before Arthur's marriage, using a small inheritance from his own mother. He had registered the deed not under the name Arthur used, but under his full birth name, Arthur Samuel Williams, a name that hadn't appeared on a legal document in decades. The deed, his father wrote, was at the bottom of the satchel. It was a separate, legally distinct property, hidden in plain sight. Beatrice and her lawyers, in their meticulous seizure of the Blackwood Ranch, would have had no record of it. They would have seen it on a map as just another piece of the vast wilderness, assuming it was part of the whole. They had taken everything he owned, but they couldn't take something they never knew existed. A low, ragged sound escaped Arthur's lips, half a sob, half a laugh. His father, the quiet, unassuming man he had always loved but perhaps never fully understood, had reached across the gulf of death and time to protect him. He had seen the serpent in his son's garden and had prepared an ark, a small, secret refuge against the coming flood. Arthur fumbled in the satchel, his fingers closing around a thick, folded document. He pulled it out. It was the deed, officially stamped and sealed by the territorial office. The name written in crisp, official ink was his. Arthur Samuel Williams. He owned this land. He owned this cabin. It wasn't a grand ranch, it wasn't a fortune, but it was something. It was a foundation. It was a place to stand when the rest of the world had been pulled out from under him. He sat there in the deepening twilight, the deed in one hand and his father's letter in the other, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a son. And you have to wonder, don't you? How many of us walk through life, never truly knowing the foresight and love of those who came before us, their secret preparations for storms they knew we'd one day have to face? He spent the next few days in a daze of discovery, cleaning the cabin, clearing the overgrown path, and making the small space his own. It felt good to work with his hands again, not for profit or for someone else's approval, but for himself. He found a small spring nearby for fresh water and learned the patterns of the deer and rabbits that shared his hidden world. With each passing day, the broken man who had arrived at the cabin began to heal, the quiet solitude of the forest acting as a balm on his wounded spirit. He read the rest of his father's letters by firelight each night. Each one revealed another layer of Samuel's quiet wisdom and foresight. But it was the last letter, tucked into a separate oilskin pouch at the very bottom of the chest, that changed everything. This letter was different. It wasn't about the land or the cabin. It was accompanied by several detailed geological sketches and what looked like assay reports from a town he didn't recognize. "Son," the letter began, "the cabin is your shelter, and the deed is your shield. But this is your sword. When I bought this land, it was not for the timber. I am not a logger. I suspected something more was here. For 2 years, I explored these hills, and I found it." Arthur's eyes scanned the page, his heart beginning to beat a frantic rhythm. His father described following a quartz seam deep into the rocky hills behind the cabin, chipping away at the rock, and finding the unmistakable glint of native silver. Not just a trace, but a small, rich vein of it running directly beneath the 50 acres. He had quietly and discreetly filed a mineral claim, registering it along with the deed, locking in the rights to whatever lay beneath the soil. "I never touched it," his father wrote. "A fortune can change a man, and not always for the better. I had enough. But I knew a day might come when you would not. This is your true inheritance, Arthur. Not to make you a wealthy man, but to make you a free 1-inch." Arthur dropped the letter, his hands trembling. He looked around the simple cabin, at the dirt floor beneath his feet, and suddenly saw it for what it was. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a marker. A treasure map where X marked the spot, and he was standing right on top of it. He spent the entire next day following his father's sketches, his old prospecting hammer in hand. He found the quartz seam, just as described. He chipped away at the rock, his excitement growing with every strike. And then he saw it. A dark, heavy rock laced with brilliant, unmistakable veins of pure silver. It was real. All of it. The humiliation in front of the courthouse, the loss of his ranch, the condescending pity in Reginald's eyes, it all seemed to shrink, to become a distant, insignificant memory. They had fought over the pastureland, the cattle, the farmhouse. They had been squabbling over the tablecloth while a feast lay hidden underneath. Beatrice and Reginald thought they had taken everything from him, but in their arrogance, they had missed the one thing that truly mattered. They had left him with the source. Months passed. Arthur worked quietly, diligently. He was no miner, but he was a quick learner, and his father's notes were a perfect guide. He used the pouch of coins Beatrice had given him, the ultimate irony, to buy basic supplies from a town a day's ride away, where no one knew his name. He spoke to a quiet, trustworthy lawyer in that town, showing him the deed and the mineral claim. The lawyer confirmed it all, it was ironclad. The land, and everything beneath it, was his and his alone. He extracted a small but steady amount of the rich ore, enough to live comfortably, enough to feel the security he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't interested in becoming a tycoon, his father's warning echoed in his mind. He just wanted to be free. But secrets, especially those that glitter, have a way of getting out. A traveling assayer he'd consulted let slip a word or two, and soon, whispers of a silver strike in the forgotten hills north of the Blackwood Ranch began to circulate. It wasn't long before those whispers reached the ears of Beatrice and Reginald. One afternoon, as Arthur was chopping wood outside his cabin, he heard the sound of approaching horses. He looked up to see two riders breaking through the trees. It was them. Beatrice's face was a thunderous mask of rage, while Reginald looked at the simple cabin and the evidence of Arthur's work with pure, undisguised greed. "What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut stone. "This is our land." "You are a trespasser." Arthur simply leaned his axe against a log and wiped his hands on his trousers. The fear and shame he once felt in her presence were gone, replaced by a deep, unshakable calm. "No, Beatrice," he said, his voice even. "This is my land." Reginald dismounted, his face flushed with anger. "The old man is delirious. We own everything from the southern fence to the river." "The law says so." "The law," Arthur replied, pulling the folded deed from his pocket, "is a funny thing. It only concerns itself with what it knows. And it knows that Arthur Samuel Williams owns these 50 acres and all the mineral rights therein. You, on the other hand, own the land next door." He held out the deed. Reginald snatched it from him, his eye scanning the document with frantic disbelief. He saw the official seal, the date that preceded their marriage by years, the name, so similar, yet legally worlds apart. He looked from the paper to Arthur, his confident smirk finally dissolving into a mask of pure, impotent fury. The power in that small clearing had shifted so completely, it was as if the world itself had tilted on its axis. The confrontation was loud on their part, silent on his. Reginald raged, calling him a thief, a liar, a cheat. Beatrice, for her part, tried a different tactic, her voice suddenly softening into a syrupy, manipulative tone. "Arthur, darling," she began, "surely this is all a misunderstanding. We were a family. We can share this. We built a life together." It was a pathetic, transparent ploy, and for the first time, Arthur saw her not as a monster, but as a small, desperate woman whose greed had finally outrun her cunning. "The family you're talking about," Arthur said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "is the one you and I both know was a lie. You didn't build a life with me. You built a business on my back. And your business has failed." Just then, another rider appeared. It was the sheriff from the neighboring county, a man Arthur had taken the liberty of informing about his claim, just in case. The sheriff, a broad, no-nonsense man named Peterson, nodded to Arthur. "Having some trouble here, Mr. Williams?" he asked, his eyes settling on Beatrice and Reginald. The use of Mr. Williams was a small but powerful confirmation of Arthur's standing. Reginald turned to the sheriff, his voice sputtering with indignation. "This man is on our property. He stole this from us." Sheriff Peterson sighed, looking unimpressed. "I've seen the deed and the claim, son. Registered and sealed 45 years ago. This land has never been part of the Blackwood Ranch. As far as the law is concerned, you're the ones trespassing." The finality in the sheriff's voice was absolute. There were no more arguments to be made, no more loopholes to exploit. They had lost. Beatrice's face, stripped of its rage and cunning, finally just looked old and tired. They had squandered the money from the ranch sale on lavish living and bad investments, assuming their wealth was endless. Now, faced with the source of a real, sustainable fortune, they had no claim to it at all. It was the perfect, poetic justice. They were left with nothing but the consequences of their own avarice, a much heavier burden than a simple bag of coins. They rode away, not with the triumphant posture of victors, but with the slumped shoulders of the utterly defeated, leaving Arthur standing in the quiet dignity of his own, true home. In the years that followed, Arthur never became the silver baron some might have expected. He hired a small, trusted crew to work the mine modestly, taking only what he needed to live a life of peace and comfort. He bought a small plot of fertile land in the valley, not far from his cabin, and started a new, smaller ranch. It wasn't the sprawling empire he had once managed, but it was his. Every fence post he drove, every calf he branded, was a testament to his own resilience. He found a different kind of wealth, one not measured in ounces of silver or head of cattle, but in quiet mornings, meaningful work, and genuine connection. He became a regular visitor to the nearby town, where he reconnected with people he'd known for years but never truly had the time to speak with. One of those people was Martha, the warm-hearted woman who ran the general store. She had always shown him a simple kindness, even when the rest of the world saw him as a failure. Their friendship blossomed, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared stories. They would sit on the porch of her store, watching the world go by, and in her company, Arthur found a warmth and acceptance he had been starved of for 40 years. News of Beatrice and Reginald's fate would drift back to him occasionally. They had lost everything. Their money gone, their reputation in tatters, they had been forced to sell what remained of their fine things and move away in disgrace. Arthur felt no joy in their ruin, only a quiet sense of balance restored. Their story became a local cautionary tale about greed and hubris. But Arthur's story? His became one of quiet triumph, of the underdog who found his footing when everyone else had counted him out. He honored his father's legacy not by hoarding the silver, but by using its freedom to live a good, honest life. The cabin in the woods remained his sanctuary, a place he would return to whenever he needed to remember where he came from. It was a symbol of his father's enduring love and a powerful reminder that sometimes, the greatest treasures are hidden away, waiting for us to be ready to find them. His life was no longer a grand, sprawling epic. It was a simple, beautiful poem, and he was finally, truly, its author. And so, we leave Arthur, not as a broken old rancher, but as a man remade, sitting on the porch of his new home, watching the sun set over a life he built not from dust and sweat, but from the ashes of betrayal. His story is a powerful lesson, isn't it? It teaches us that our worth is never, ever defined by what others can take from you. It's not in the land, the money, or the titles. True worth is intrinsic. It's the strength you find when you have nothing left. It's the resilience that allows you to get back up after you've been knocked down, time and time again. It's the quiet dignity you carry when the world tries to humiliate you. Beatrice and Reginald saw Arthur as just a tool, an old piece of farm equipment to be used and discarded. But they, and the world, made a classic mistake. They judged the book by its worn, dusty cover, never imagining the rich, incredible story hidden within its pages. They never understood that the quietest people often have the deepest reserves of strength, and that true inheritance isn't something that's given to you, but something that is revealed within you. So, I want you to think about that. Think about the times you felt underestimated, overlooked, or cast aside. Remember Arthur. Remember that what people see on the surface is rarely the whole story. Deep within you, there might be a hidden cabin, a secret map, a vein of silver that no one knows exists. Your true inheritance isn't what you lose, it's what you find in the aftermath. It's the discovery that you are more resourceful, more resilient, and more valuable than anyone, including perhaps yourself, ever gave you credit for. Don't ever let someone else's valuation of you become your reality. Your story is your own. The final chapter hasn't been written yet. And who knows? It may just be the most triumphant one of all.